It's July 20th, 2023. This is the Roqe. Well, hi there. Welcome. Are you finished coughing? It's your first time back in months, and this is the way you start. Welcome to episode 273 of
Roqe. You want to give it away?
I'm Jian Gomeshi. Hello from Toronto. Salam Dustan Aziz Durup Hashim. I hope you are doing well wherever you are tuning in from around the world. We're on an ongoing mission to build a new audio-visual encyclopedia of Iranian diaspora identity. I will explain who that voice you just heard is, or the rabid coughing that you heard over the opening theme. But first, drinking in Iran. That is today's topic, today's theme. Drinking in Iran, more specifically the paradox of alcohol in the Islamic world. On the one hand, it's forbidden. On the other hand, the history of the Middle East, the Islamic world, Iran is awash in drinking, in alcohol. So how do we make sense of this? There's a little bit of a backstory to the guest today, who is Dr. Rudi Matthee, who's got this brand new book. I don't even know I think the book just has been published. It's called Angels Tapping at the Wine Shop's Door, A History of Alcohol in the Islamic World. So Dr. Rudi Matthee was on our show a couple of years ago, maybe, for the Contemporary History of Iran, and he'd written a book which is about drug practices and drug consumption in Iran, particularly opium, which we did the interview about. Fascinating, got a lot of response. People were really interested. At the time, he said, I'm finishing a book on alcohol and the Islamic world and of the contradictions therein. And it was like, well, geez, tell us when the book is done. You know, a couple months ago, he sent me an email. The book is done and it's coming out, and I've just finished reading it. I'm looking forward to talking to him. It is such a rich area to talk about, and we're going to spend this show, today's episode, entirely on the idea of alcohol, drinking, and where this fits in culturally, socially, historically, politically, religiously, in the case of Iran. In the studio, Smart Pegah is here in the studio.
Hello.
Dr. Rudi Matthee will be joining us for the feature interview in just a little bit. And also, sitting in the studio, the dramatic coughing return of Captain Reza.
Hey,
hello, sir.
Hello, sir.
You have... don't you love that... you know, we talk regularly, we're friends, but the show that I invite you back to is about drinking. What does this say about how I see you? A show about alcoholism. Let's get Reza.
I know. Like, actors went on strike. You guys done shows about all sorts of things that we have so many mutual, areas of interest. And then I get this call. Jian is like, hey, I know you're busy. You're working and stuff. We're doing a show. I want to have you on. And there's this great guest you're going to love. There's Shiraz involved and a lot of drinking, bro. So do you want to be on?
Well, am I wrong? This is something you know about. At least
that context,
the social etiquette of drinking
I grew up
in contemporary Iran. You grew up in Iran. Shiraz, the party town. Post-revolution. And what we're exploring is, I mean, this is, for me, these are the things that, as someone who didn't grow up in Iran, are always mess with my head. Where, what are the mechanics of how this all works? Yeah. You know, it's like there's no dancing, but everybody knows how to dance. Well, where do they dance? You know, I mean, I kind of know that one, but what the actual pipelines are, and how this happened historically with the coming of Islam, that not only did the prohibition of alcohol not work clearly, but that our culture is so rich in drinking, poetry, art about that involves drinking, that the romance of drinking, the social. Now that I've read the book, I mean, there's so much detail to go into. But I was thinking about what I always think of as when it comes to Iranians. First of all, I've never thought of, I do think of Iranians as drinkers. Like this is one of those things where the outside world thinking Islamic country, you know, oh, these people don't, you know, they're not familiar with the,
Couldn't be
Little
farther
do they
from
know.
truth.
right. Yeah. I mean, this is a drinking culture.
Heavily, like you could say, like we compete with the Irish. Like it's especially post like the generation that like in the 80s and 90s that grew up.
Where things really, the crackdown really happened.
Yeah, and it was like extremely prohibited to drink, and there was nothing else to do. It's not like it's not like it's prohibited to drink, but you have Wonderland and you could go like bowling with your girlfriend, but just don't drink. It's just none of that. You can't wear colors.
Wonderland is a theme park, by the way.
Oh, by the way,
Canada, for people listening in
Wondering.
Australia,
Listen,
wondering what
that
Wonderland.
was a smart choice of word, because for people around the world, they would associate that with Alice in Wonderland, which is quite a magical place.
Sure.
You see, you
Works
you
as a
gotta
metaphor.
stop questioning.
I got to stop not giving you credit.
And stop inviting me for drugs and alcohol related theme programs.
Well, you seemed very enthusiastic. You were like, yes, immediately. I can't wait to hear that interview.
Hey, this is the history of it.
What would you say? I mean, we'll get into the interview and you'll hear me talk about the book, and I don't want to get your reactions after I speak to Dr. Rudi Matthee, but what would you say, how do you make sense of the paradox of something that was forbidden and something that was, I'm assuming, ubiquitous as you were growing up? I mean, where did you see alcohol and how did you receive it and all of that?
Well, in the house, and it was always known as arak sagi, which is something that is even sold in Toronto, Canada, at the LCBO, like a legitimate liquor license store. And it's a Persian liquor, essentially, that homemade. Vodka-esque, yeah, kind of cognac-y type. And it's homemade, usually. And there are sagis around town. And everybody has kind of like a dealer on, like you have 2 or 3 numbers that you call. One is not available to call.
And are the dealers usually non-Muslims?
No, well, not always. Here's the thing. There was... When I was younger,
because they're allowed, like Armenians are allowed to have alcohol, right?
They're not allowed to sell, but they're allowed to have and make for their own consumption. But I do remember vividly that, like, when I was like 5 or 6, my dad like would have this Armenian guy who would bring him like alcohol and stuff, and then. I got older, and in my teens, that wasn't the case. Like, it was like Ali Abbasi he's also in Basijam has khodesh chizay khub. It's like corruption dug deep. It became like more of an underground way of making money kind of thing.
Well, just canvassing the Roqe team and people I've been talking to over the last week, it almost started to become a joke. It's like everybody's got an Armenian. I got an Armenian guy who's a really great guy. He gets me the, and so these are the contacts that people have. I still don't know. I mean, how, for example, I'm going to ask Dr. Rudi about it. I mean, he's doing a history of the last 1,000 years. So, but in contemporary Iran, how on the one hand, first of all, the rules seem to be all over the place. On the one hand, there's people getting arrested and put in jail for long periods of time, years. For one of our team members said they know somebody who went to jail for 11 years for being caught with alcohol. Crazy. And then on the other hand, people are having these parties all the time. It's like white marriage. It's like a lot of the things where a lot of especially younger Iranians are just going to, fuck it. I mean, we're going to do what we do. Do you have any personal relationship with Iran and alcohol, Pegah?
With an Armenian?
Well, I mean...
no, you know what? The one time that I've been back to Iran, like when I was, 17, I think it was, obviously there were a lot of family events and parties and things like that. And I never once thought about it, thinking, well, where is this alcohol coming from? Because it was just so
it's there. It's
available.
There. Yeah,
like
it's
it
the
was
amazing
no
thing.
Difference.
It's an amazing thing. One of the things he says in this book is that due to the fact that it has been taboo, because it is officially forbidden for so many centuries in the Islamic world, there's no particular open culture of sociability that developed, say, like with red wine, having it enliven meals in a restaurant or something like that, sipping it at a gathering. So alcohol took on this express purpose to get drunk. as fast as possible. This is he says this in the book, and I'm going to ask him about it. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, sometimes patterns of behavior that have long, deep roots in history will still assert themselves, even when the sociocultural context is different. So I find Iranians today do generally seem to drink to get drunk.
Excessively.
Like it's like this is a thing we know about Iranian parties. It's like you get there and it's already to do the tequila shots.
Gotta be hammered.
And really, I mean, this is a stereotype, obviously, and obviously there are people who, for whom this isn't true, as with the Irish, etc. But I would say of all the cultures and peoples that we know, I mean, if I were to stereotype Canadians, I would say going to a bar is not about within the first half an hour getting as drunk as you possibly can and doing as many tequila shots as you can. And yet isn't it interesting how that lineage, that sort of that practice carries through to Iranians in the diaspora in North America that really have nothing to do with the taboo
almost
nature.
Like a psychological overcompensation that you carry over for like generations. Like these people never had to deal with that kind of, or if they did, like it wasn't
absolutely.
But you see the effect of it very like blatantly in their behavior.
You also see it in what they choose to drink. Like if you look
yes,
like
that's
I've
actually
never,
a fair
I mean, I
assessment.
can't say never, but most Iranians I know, it's like tequila or whiskey or
hard, like a vodka.
Yeah, exactly. Or a vodka. Like these are your three choices. It's like tequila, vodka, whiskey.
Yeah.
That's it.
I had a party a few years ago like 3 or 4 years ago, and I used to, my parties, like Canadian kind of party, I would have wine and beer.
Right.
And that was usually enough.
Yeah.
Because you can't offer the entire people. Yeah. The Persians were mad at me.
Where's the
It was
whiskey?
like, what is this?
I remember.
What do you? This isn't what. How are we supposed to be social with this stuff? What a wine and the jokes, and they were just like, oh, so you don't want anybody to get drunk, and what you want? It was like, geez, wow, the judgment. I gotta get the hard liquor out.
I think the first time I was taken aback by that was when I went to one of these like Persian events, like a concert or something like that. And so I had been to other concerts and whatever else, but I went to this Iranian concert and I went to the bar and I was like, they have whiskey and tequila shots and things like that. Whereas if you go to a concert, like a non-Iranian concert, there's beer. There's beer. And now maybe one of those like, I don't know, seltzers or whatever.
Right,
but there's definitely no tequila shots lined up.
And then the crowd gets wasted and they don't really care about the music on the stage. I mean, the whole thing.
What about gin and tonic? Is that considered hard drink?
Well, it's alcohol. Yeah. It's not
That's your favorite drink.
That is my favorite. Well, yeah, that and I mean I do like the tequila. Don't get me wrong. Okay, so Dr. Rudi Matthee coming up with his new book and will untangle this paradox of alcohol in the Islamic world, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Before we wanted to get there, though, I wanted to. I've been kind of obsessed with this song. It's a brand new song that is in the UK charts. I'm into the UK stuff, my British background, and Captain Reza being the director of what was it called again?
Bravo! Only the matter of time before he forgot.
Talking to Persians, London.
Program.
We went to Britain.
Jian, Roqe, Roqe.
Talking to Persians, London, and that was an exploration of England. Anyway, on the music charts right now in England, there's a song. I'm into UK hip hop. There's a band called DBE, a hip hop group called DBE. Do you know this song?
No.
Oh, D Block Europe. They got a sound person, Louise. Can you hit a bit? They got this. Go for it. Just play it. They got a new song that is on the charts. The song's called Pakistan.
Oh,
okay. D Block Europe, DBE featuring Clavish. Take a listen to this.
Take me home, my dad is from Iran. I got a brick of heroin from Pakistan. I ain't buy that bitch no bag. I bought my killer's firearm. Burners from Russia, Louis V from Milan.
Okay, so did you catch turn down a little bit? Did you catch the first line?
Yes, I did.
Do you know, what did he say?
He said something from Iran.
He said, did you catch it?
Teriyaki?
She can't take me home. Her dad is from Iran.
Oh.
Oh, she can't. I
Wow.
thought he said I took hashish from Iran.
No.
Then
He
was
goes to say, I
talking
got heroin from Pakistan, but which he's doing the rhyme of Pakistan and Iran. But she can't take me home. Her dad is from Iran. I think I think that is the greatest opening line to a song by
And-
non-Iranians.
and
no less.
accurate, so accurate.
Well, exactly. What is that? Could you want to
Well,
decode that for us?
Oh my God! Do I need to? Like, if there is one person out there who's ever dated an Iranian girl, they know the.
Hang on a second.
how-
Here it comes again. Turn up.
She can't take me home, my dad is from Iran.
There we go.
Okay.
Of course, because it's conservative. That can't happen.
It rings a little too
happen.
close to home for me.
Hey, listen.
the Persian dads I've
funny
dealt
enough,
with.
Funny enough, you brought that up because I just got off the phone with a friend of mine yesterday who told me his sister is pregnant. They're not married. He's dating a guy, a boyfriend.
Iranian?
Iranian. The guy is Iranian. They're happy. Couldn't be more cheerful. They told their parents, and the girl's parents, obviously, who are separated. They're not even together,
Okay.
living together. They got together, they joined force against this tragedy, catastrophe of history, and they made his life a living hell for the past like 2 weeks. It's just fights and over again over conservativeness, like old ideologies.
Yeah, Persian dads. There's some. It's something's in the sauce.
Good, the guy had a chip on their shoulder.
She can't take me home, my dad is from Iran.
Of course, baby.
Got a brick of
So
heroin
anyway,
from Pakistan.
DVE. The song is called Pakistan. If you're interested out there, yeah, it rings a little too close to home for me, for sure. But it's such a funny. What I love is that. This group, I mean, the song's called Pakistan. They're in the UK. They're these brown guys. It's not. I'm pretty sure none of them. I know Clavishes. I don't think the D-Block guys are Iranian. But they've got this line that not only do we understand, but they expect everybody else to understand too, right? She can't take me over dad's from Iran. Oh yeah, well of course.
Yeah, that's crazy that we don't even bat an eye.
All right. Thank you, Captain Reza.
Thank you.
Smart Pegah. We'll come back to you right after this interview with Dr. Rudi. I should mention we are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It's there that you can link to all of our platforms: Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Instagram, CastBox. If you like to see some visuals with Roqe, switch over to YouTube right now. And if you like your Roqe descriptions and bulletins in both English and in Persian, check us out on Telegram. Remember, you can support us by going to roqemedia.com and pressing the Support Us button, where you can become a Roqe member on Patreon. Hey, if you have the means, if you don't, that's okay. If you do, and you can support us and you can help us out and you've been part of the crowdfunding, go to, again, the website, roqemedia.com, press the Support Us, and you get, you'll link to a page where you can become a Roqe member through our Patreon page for a few bucks a month, and we really appreciate it. All right, let's get to our guests. Well, we all know that alcohol is officially forbidden under Islam, but we also know that most of the Islamic world, including Iran, has a long history that is drenched in drinking and culturally entwined with the consumption, celebration, romance, medicinal practice of wine, beer, alcohol. So how do we make sense of this? The great contradictions of alcohol and Islam. Well, we are fortunate to have a returning guest who knows this field, an American academic who is an expert in early modern Iran and has literally just released a fine and comprehensive book on the subject. Dr. Rudi Matthee is a distinguished professor of Middle Eastern history at the University of Delaware, specializing in the Safavid and Qajar dynasties. He is a member of the Association of the Study of Persianate Societies and has served as its president on 2 occasions. Professor Matthee has been honored with several prestigious awards, including the Albert Hourani Book Prize presented by the Middle East Association of North America, the Saidi Sirjani Book Award granted by the International Society for Iranian Studies, and the British Kuwaiti Friendship Book Prize. He's authored numerous influential books and articles, including The Politics of Trade in Safavid Iran, The Pursuit of Pleasure, Drugs and Stimulants in Iranian History, Persia in Crisis, Safavid Decline and the Fall of Isfahan, and Russians in Iran, Diplomacy and Power in the Qajar Era and Beyond. His brand new book, hot off the presses, is entitled Angels Tapping at the Wine Shop's Door, A History of Alcohol in the Islamic World. And right now, Dr. Rudi Matthee joins me. Hello, sir.
Thank you very much, Jian, for that kind and very generous introduction. And it's wonderful to be back. Thanks for inviting me again.
I've been so. By the way, I usually say joins me from somewhere, but I don't know where you are. Are you in Delaware?
I am in Delaware. I was in Italy until 2 weeks ago, or two days ago actually.
Ah,
But I'm back home right now.
that would have been much more glamorous to say he joins me from Milan or something. But
I actually did an interview on VOA Persian from northern Italy last week. So
well, it's good to have you back at the home base, and it's good to have you on the program. And so, just a bit of a backstory for the people listening. We had you on for that book, The Pursuit of Pleasure, Drugs and Stimulants in Iranian History, talking about opium, talking about the background, the last 200 years, especially of drug use in Iran. And it was such a fascinating conversation. We got so much feedback for it. And at that time, you had said, I'm working on a book about alcohol in the Islamic world. And I had been savoring the opportunity both to read this book and to interview you about it. It has been as satisfying as I expected. I've learned a lot reading the book. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Let me start with a general question that you can answer briefly, because it's going to, I suspect, form the spine of the conversation we're going to have over the next 45 minutes. At the heart of your book lies a paradox. Islam forbids alcohol, and yet alcohol has had an essential cultural role in Muslim societies over the ages. So, to quote you early in the book, you say, consuming alcohol in an Islamic environment sounds oxymoronic, but in reality has always been part of the multiplicity of life, officially banned, but effectively tolerated at the margins. It is quite a tangled contradiction. So in simple terms, how are we to understand the relationship between Muslims and alcohol?
very good. Well, you strike at the heart of the argument and the problematic of the book. You know, the book really navigates what I call a dichotomous image of Islam. On the one hand, we have this notion of Islam being a frivolous faith given to the delights of the flesh, indulgent, pleasure-seeking. And on the other hand, we have this idea of the narrow-minded faith, rule-bound, dogmatic, intolerant, forbidding, averse to fun. Remember, Khomeini said there is no fun in Islam. And so the first one is, of course, sort of the classic Orientalist perception of Islam, right? It's also devoid of a moral core, which is part and parcel of this idea that it's pleasure-seeking and indulgent and so forth, sort of decorative. But the second image is, of course, more contemporary and is adhered to not just by Westerners, but also many Muslims, fundamentalist Islam, if you will, you know, averse to pleasure. And so that the book is really an attempt to sort of break out of the dichotomy, if you will. And it uses alcohol as a portal and as a window to do so. And my argument really is that, like all religions, by the way, necessarily, Islam in its traditional guise and appearance is very capacious. It's capable of embracing contradiction and paradox, you know, seeming contradictions, and appears as, you know, with a lot of ambiguity, even in the transparent or the apparent transgressions that Muslims commit. They do not invalidate Islam, as far as I'm concerned. They indeed confirm Islam. You know, who knows about Abu Nuwas? You know, this sort of scandalous wine-drinking, wine-swilling poet who sticks it in the eye of the clerics and celebrates wine and wants to be buried, you know, and under an avalanche of wine.
Right,
you know, that is all being moved out. So that is really the heart of the book.
I mean, let me just break down a little bit of what you've said there, because to a certain extent, I can imagine for a lot of, say, Iranians listening to this, or people who come from this part of the world, from the Islamic world, it's not going to be a shock to them that there's this contradiction. And yet you talk about the orthodoxy. I mean, you mentioned Khomeini there, and what was the famous pronouncement? God did not create man so that he could have fun, right? So you would say that the orthodoxy, the general view of the Islamic world and alcohol consumption has usually been that they are mutually exclusive, yes?
Yes, and my argument is they're not. They're
Yes.
an extension of one another. They are complementary in some ways. But, you know, it's not enough to say that, well, you know, Iranians drink typically, or many of them, and have always done. And you look at Hafiz, and it's completely integral. So alcohol is fine. No, if you go to the text, to the scriptural version of Islam, and you have to do that at some point, then you will say that it's much more problematic. See, also look at Islam, both as faith and practice. I don't separate these two. Both scripture, text, the Quran, the Hadith, the presumed sayings of the Prophet and his companions on the one hand, but it's also the lived practice by Muslims who have not always abided by the rules. I mean, let's also realize that until quite recently, the vast majority of people were illiterate. They couldn't read the Quran, let alone the Hadith or any kind of learned disposition on Islam. So that alone accounts in part for all these infractions. You can be a good Muslim. You don't know what Islam is all about. You drink because you come from a tradition where drinking is integral, and you live next to an Armenian.
Can you tell me about the impetus for this book before we get into the details? I mean, why you wanted to write this? You make the case at one point in the book that the whole idea that alcohol is forbidden in the Islamic world, especially in places like Iran today, affects, of course, your ability to find and have an honest discourse about it when you're in these places or dealing with people in these places. There hasn't even been a lot of research in the area, you say, in terms of the depth of the research that you would find about other places of the world and alcohol consumption. Is that what intrigued you? Is that what led you to want to deal with this?
Well, there are different elements. First of all, my past, being Dutch, growing up in the 60s and 70s and being in touch with alcohol and drugs to a moderate extent. But more importantly, studying the Middle East and Iran in particular, I was always struck between the distinction, the distance oftentimes between appearance and reality, which of course exists in all societies, but I thought it was particularly pronounced in Islamic societies in Iran. The whole idea of ta'aruf, for example, is sort of speaks that whole thing. So I was always intrigued by that. And I ended up writing this earlier book, of course, where I encountered all these same things and tried to find some kind of solution to it. And then alcohol is, of course, kind of the substance par excellence, because it is also, unlike opium, for example, explicitly forbidden, at least partly in the Quran itself. So you have that kind of tension between proscription on the one hand, and then the juggernaut that alcohol is proven to be in human history. And that includes, of course, the Middle East. In other words, Muslims drink, and arguably they drink more in terms of volume than most other people. So it's a fascinating topic, and that's really the answer to the question, as far as I'm concerned.
Do you run into roadblocks if you're dealing with something, the discussion of something that's forbidden in the area in which you're covering? Was it more difficult to get the research?
No, I mean, the book is, of course, not based on interviews or anything. It's all textual. But to the extent I lived and traveled and worked in the Middle East, I have never had any issue in Iran. Iranians are completely convinced that, alcohol is, to the extent that they're Muslim at all, something that, God has created for good reason. And so I have never had any awkward discussions. The Arab world is somewhat different. I already got an email saying that there is no drinking in Islam. So, well, read my book. There is a much more sort of, I hesitate the word dogmatic, but somewhat less flexible perception. But this is Islam, and therefore it doesn't exist, or it shouldn't exist. Certainly, in Iran, it's much more let live and let live in terms of attitude. Is my experience.
Early in the book, you set the stage for what this region, which we might call, includes the Middle East, we'll call West Asia or North Africa, what we now would know as the Islamic world. You set the stage by saying, in this area, before the coming of Islam, it was actually awash in alcohol. You say that the earliest evidence of wine culture, in fact, going back 9,000 years, was where we would now consider the Middle East. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a very important and really an essential element in the whole story. Islam is, of course, kind of a newcomer if you look at the longevity of the Middle East. And alcohol as a substance goes back to precisely the area where Islam emerged and spread to very quickly. Armenia and Georgia, the Zagros Mountains, northwestern Iran, Azerbaijan, eastern Anatolia. I was in Armenia a few weeks ago, and I visited a cave where you had these wine vessels 6,000 years old in a tradition that is still alive in the southern Caucasus. So it is not surprising at all that Islam inherited all kinds of ideas and customs preceding it. And that is just one of them, of course. There is also the Persian and the Persianate tradition, the pre-Islamic one, a wash in wine, ritualized wine drinking, wine standing for flowing fire and the radiant sun of Zoroastrianism. There's a Turkic Mongolian tradition coming from Central Asia, hard drinking by warriors on horseback. They brought that to the Islamic world. So it's really an amalgamation of a number of different traditions coming together with Islam overlaid, attempting to restrict and marginalize it, but being not very successful for all these reasons. You don't just wipe out a tradition that is, thousands of years old.
And even the word alcohol is Arabic in origin, yes?
Yes. Alcohol means, eyeliner, black eyeliner. Absolutely. And even the word booze, the English word booze, the slang word booze, is presumably, we're not 100% sure, but most likely derived from booza, which is a lightly alcoholic drink that was mostly, comes from Central Asia, was ubiquitous in the Ottoman Empire. So there are all these connections and references, absolutely.
And of course, the person credited with the invention of the process of distillation is the Iranian Muslim alchemist Razi, right?
That's right. Exactly.
So if you said that alcohol is not only present throughout the history of the region and culture, but also plays a conspicuous role in the Islamic world, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean by that, if you look at the history, and I do so, of course, in the book, because I trace the consumption of alcohol through time, all the way from the time of the Prophet to today, to the Qatar World Soccer tournament in November. Those are my last references. You will see that there's an enormous amount of drinking. A lot of it is hidden and marginal and performed in the form of subterfuge. But almost one of the elements that strikes one is precisely the excessiveness of the drinking, which of course has to do with the forbidden fruit element. Something that's forbidden becomes especially attractive. And there's also this notion that, whether you drink one drop or a whole barrel doesn't make any difference. The sin has been committed regardless. So you might as well drink a barrel. And the third element is precisely, again, because alcohol, that is red wine, is officially prescribed in Islam, alcohol never became integrated into sort of social etiquette. The Greek to the French tradition, so to speak, enlivening a social event, a meal, and so forth. It's drinking to get drunk for the most part, which is a stereotype, but I think it's also true. There's so many references, both by Muslims and non-Muslims, to that same pattern throughout time.
Yeah. You talk about that. The intention is to get wasted. It's not necessarily to
quickly as possible, strong as possible booze.
Which, by the way, is still the intention in your average British pub on a Friday night. But I'm curious about the mechanics of how this works. So in the first lands that are conquered by Islam, like say Syria and Egypt and Iran, you talk about how vineyards were to be found everywhere in these places. So how were these new Muslims to contend with this new reality of a religion that was at odds with their trade, with these vineyards, and with their drinking practices?
Yeah, well, it's a variegated picture, of course. In some places, the vineyards were ripped up, we know that, and the wine trade withered or even disappeared. In other parts, it continued, depending on all kinds of circumstances, soil and fertility and the nature of the population, and how fast Islam gained ground. Because that's another myth, of course, that Islam fell from the sky, and then within a decade or two or a century or so, everyone converted to Islam. Nothing is further from the truth. Ottoman Empire, into the 20th century, almost 50% of the population was still Greek and Armenian Christian, with important and natural effects on the amount of drinking. Because, of course, the people of the book, Jews, Christians, and honorary people of the book being Zoroastrians in Iran, were allowed to manufacture and consume alcohol within their own communities. But, of course, that spilled over into the Muslim communities. In other words, the taverns frequented by common people typically were in Jewish or Zoroastrian or Armenian neighborhoods. And even today in Iran, you have an Armenian friend, and that gives you a supply of booze, without having to pay for black market prices.
Right.
So all these elements play a very important role. And you see this in Iran, for example, the parts where Judaism and the Armenians are heavily represented, say Hamadan and parts of Azerbaijan, the northwest, Urumiyeh and so forth, Zanjan, but also parts of Khorasan, the Kurds were also notorious drinkers. You have plenty of drinking, but in some other places it's not so much. Shiraz, of course, sort of stereotypically a city of pleasure,
Yes.
Dar al-H, they called it. A lot of drinking, rather uninhibited.
Yeah.
So it's a complex picture. Like
Your
else.
book definitely makes Shiraz look like the place to be in terms of a lot of the over the centuries. So a lot of the consumption.
Exactly. Yes.
If that's what you're looking for, that is.
Right.
Can you do a bit of an Islam 101 with apologies to people out there who would already know all of this stuff? I certainly don't. I've tried to read the Quran a few times and it's very difficult for me. Islam is the only major world religion that forbids alcohol consumption.
Yes.
So give it to us simply. Why? What are the reasons the Islamic scriptures deem wine to be prohibited, for example?
Right. Well, it's to some extent speculative, of course, because the Quran is not a history book, right? And it's open to interpretation and is oftentimes obscure and is not as sequential as, say, the Bible in terms of narrative structure. It's much more chopped up. It doesn't have a, chronological sequence. So it's a very difficult book to read and interpret for that matter. But if you extract references in various surahs to wine, to alcohol, you will see that in one surah, wine is called a divine gift, something beneficial, right? It doesn't say you have to drink for that reason, but it's there, right? And then there are other surahs where people are warned and admonished not to drink too much. And then ultimately in Surah 5, Al-Ma'idah, the table, wine is prescribed, but it's not wine, it's khamr, which in Arabic means red wine, okay? And it's left at that. And it's forbidden, it's prescribed together with gambling. And the reason really, and that is explicitly mentioned, is that it detracts from being a good Muslim because you cannot pray properly with a drunken head, right? Which makes sense. You have to have, your faculties in order. Now, so that's one reason. But
with that reason, the problem is not the wine; it's the drunkenness, right?
That is one argument that has been, brought to bear on that particular. Almost as a justification. That means 5 drops is okay as long as they don't get drunk.
Right.
But, back and forth. But then, if you look at it historically, to the extent that we can construct a historical narrative, both Muslims and non-Muslim exegetes have argued that this seeming jumble, because, Surah 2, there's no chronological sequence here, but it probably means that the Prophet had a problem with his companions getting drunk. So he sort of tightened the rules over time in order to, and then in the end, he completely forbade it. But the ambiguity is still built in because red wine doesn't mean explicitly, at least, white wine. Does it stand for wine made of fruit, date wine? And let alone forms of alcohol that didn't exist in the 7th and 8th centuries, such as cognac and Roqe, and let alone champagne. Are they included?
Right.
Is wine... alcohol sort of reduced to 1/3 of its essence. Is that allowed?
And what's the answer to all that?
Well, it varies from school to school.
Right.
You have 4 schools in Islam. And of course, the so-called Hanbalis, who are prevalent in the Arabian Peninsula, for them, absolutely anything, even a drop, is completely out of the question. Most schools, and that includes Shiism, by the way, follow the same kind of argument with some exceptions. For example, nabith, wine not made from red grapes, is up to a point perhaps permissible.
What is that about?
Because,
what's the thing
hadith
with the grapes?
says that even Aisha drank nabith, so there are some precedents there. The Hanafis, who are prevalent in the Turkish and the Turkic world, are most open-minded about it in terms of, say, accepting alcohol that did not exist at the time of the Prophet. So they're not as literalist as the other ones. But there is always this notion within strict moderation.
So in terms of the traditions that argue that grapes are to be avoided, the argument would be that, say, fig wine or date wine is okay?
Well, in some cases, again, it varies from scholar, from exegete to exegete.
Well, is
You
there? I
know,
need a handbook. How do I know what I'm allowed to drink where I go from place to
well,
place?
that'd be a 1,000-page book, and because I mean, this tradition of interpretation upon interpretation continues until today. It conducted online today by pious Muslims, and they ask their muftis, "Can I use nail polish when it, contains a sprinkle of alcohol?" And then
Right,
the
right.
answer varies from person to person. So you really get into the minutiae of these things.
And then at the same time, wine itself was said to enhance religious experiences, right?
Yes, because of course, that's the other extreme of religion. That's precisely what makes Islam, in its traditional guise, so capacious, because you have all this nitpicking about, can you drink this or that? And no, you can't drink anything on the one hand. And then you have the whole tradition of literature, Sufism, mysticism, where wine is celebrated as enhancing the bond with God, representing beauty, the beauty of the universe as created by God, and the beauty of actual nature. The sort of the red wine refracted in sunlight and the beautiful colors it spreads around, and the whole panoply of metaphors and symbolism that you find in glorious Sufi Iranian poetry. And that's all there, and that was never repressed, and it's still not repressed because it's so much and so integrally part of Persian and ultimately Islamic culture.
Let me pick up on that because that is one of the ways we obviously know that that alcohol and that wine was not banished, that it existed, that it was celebrated, that it was integrally involved in the culture is through the poets and through the art, and wine has this central role in, as you say, in the poetry of Hafez and many other Persian poets, and you say that wine serves as the lifeblood of the
Sure.
rich Persian poetic tradition, symbolizing earthly pleasure and aesthetic refinement, and the intoxication that stands for the self-effacing quality of the bond between the mystic and the divine. Tell us a bit about this. How did early Persian poets see the place of alcohol, of wine in our lives?
Well, I would like to expand that beyond Persian poets because Arab poets play exactly the same role. Abu Nuwas, of course, there's a bit of discussion. He's a Persian because he was born in Ahwaz, but of course, it's still mostly Arabic speaking. Even today, he wrote mostly in Arabic, so he can legitimately be called an Arab poet. And of course, there are lots of early Arab poets, really from the 7th century. And it's really a sort of a seamless transition from pre-Islam to Islam, who also celebrate wine for the same type of reasons, for the life-giving elements, the expansive notion, the sheer beauty, the aestheticism, the sophistication of it all, but also, as a metaphor, as a symbolism of negating the dogmatism of Islam, the intolerance, sort of, expressing one's freedom, inner freedom through wine. And that's, of course, where Persian poetry reaches absolute, sublime heights. The other element, of course, and that goes back to the beginning too, is kind of ridiculing the cant and hypocrisy of the clergy, of the hardliners. Hafiz is, of course, fantastic. He soils the carpet, the prayer carpet with wine, right, in order to show how his rendi, how in his inner freedom, way beyond the strict and kind of narrow-minded, pettifogging adherence to Islam, which is good enough for ordinary people. But he's beyond that. And again, he uses wine to mock the clergy, who themselves, of course, drink wine in unseen moments. All these elements are prevalent and present and are celebrated in especially Iranian poetry, but not at the exclusion of Arab and even Turkish poetry, because you have the same traditions that continue over time. Less well known, but just as prevalent and just as potent, I would say.
Can I just ask you about terms? Because you were just talking about wine, and your book, in the title of your book, you've got wine, but you also talk about alcohol throughout the book. Are we using these words interchangeably, or is there different rules and traditions around, say, vodka that there would be for wine?
Yeah, there is, of course, they all contain alcohol to that extent. We're all talking about the same thing, but we're not in the sense that in early Islam, we had wine and in various guises, fruit wine, date wine, regular wine, white and red, and so forth. And there was this, the Turks brought in mare's milk, hummus, and so forth. And then you have booza, and then ultimately different and new forms of alcohol come in through the West, cognac and champagne. Vodka is fairly old, but not as old as Islam itself. And with these new forms and these extraneous forms, not indigenous ones, the whole question of what is forbidden, is Roqe forbidden, which didn't exist until the 17th century, becomes an open question for some people, because it's not mentioned in the Quran. It didn't exist at the time.
Right.
But ultimately, for the hardliners, it doesn't matter. It's about alcohol.
You were talking about poetry. There's also, in your book, you talk about the visual arts of the Islamic world also being awash in portrayals of drinking. What do we learn from what we see in the visual arts?
Yeah, well, the visual art here, it's important, I think, to make a distinction between the Western and Eastern half of the Islamic world, with the Iranian, the Eastern half, being much more tolerant and capacious and open to the visual representation of wine. You have these beautiful illustrated manuscripts of, Shah Abbas sort of, making out or oogling a male page who offers him wine, which is actually a rarity because typically the ruler is not depicted in painting representing wine. But you have all these wonderful images, and you've seen them, I'm sure, of Sufis dancing, and even women dallying around, and lovers offering each other wine and so forth. It's ubiquitous in the Persian tradition, less so in the Arab painting tradition, which is less strong anyway, and has always been much more strict about the ban on graven images than the Eastern half of the Islamic world.
By the way, you mentioned Shah Abbas. This is in the 17th century, arguably the most celebrated of the Safavid rulers. You say at one point in the book that this guy consumed alcohol at all hours of the day. This was
Yes, yeah. It's reported by more than one observer. For throughout the Islamic world, there's really that shahs and sultans and khans were allowed to drink because they sort of inhabited their own moral universe, right? But it should not come at the expense of good statecraft. In other words, they shouldn't become drunk. Now, that was violated left and right because the history, you read it, I'm sure, is filled with caliphs from the very beginning. I mean, just absolutely, sloshed all the time.
Right.
But Shah Abbas abided by that rule. He drank like, every hour a glass, so to speak, but he never went beyond the limit. So he never lost self-control, which is also in part why he's celebrated, because he didn't violate that rule of losing the kind of control that means you cease to be a good, proper ruler taking care of your people.
Yes. These technicalities are, of course, ridiculous because who's going to be the arbiter of how many cups you could have before you're losing control?
That's
other than the bartender
times
down the street who says you're cut off,
that's
buddy.
Where the scientific inquiry comes in, and that's a matter of modern times, of course.
But when you mention the kings and their courtiers, drinking and all that, at the same time, several sultans and shahs throughout these centuries tried to ban alcohol. I'm going to ask you about the 20th century in a moment, and in fact the 21st century. But is it fair to say? I mean, we learned certainly in North America from the 1920s, and some people would argue we learned this with weed too and stuff, that prohibition doesn't work. Is it fair to say that none of these shahs and sultans in any of these parts of the Islamic world were ever particularly successful in ridding the society of alcohol?
Yeah, I think you could say that as a general statement. Attempts were made. It's not as though that everyone drank and it was just, a merry society. No one cared. Typically, drinking was allowed, permitted to the elite, the upper classes, because they could hold their liquor, they could handle it, whereas the middling segments of population, then and now, typically never touched alcohol, And then, of course, so were lower castes, the down and out, because they were irredeemable. You know what I mean? It was like Britain in the 18th century with gin. The toffs, the elite could handle their liquor. Besides, it usually and almost exclusively took place within the confines of the private mansion, right? And ordinary people, they would get drunk, and they could be contained up to a point, and there were brawls and riots and so forth. But they were irredeemable. So the only thing you could do was contain. And so there's something similar there. There's a real class distinction. And there was a lot of drinking on the part of the courts with the boon companions and so forth. But that doesn't mean that one could ignore the Islamic law. It was invoked periodically. And there are a couple of sort of moments when you see this happen. When the Shah or Sultan comes to power, he has to establish his credentials as a good Islamic ruler. So he issues a ban, right? But it's kind of ritualistic. It's pro forma in a way, it's performative. And then it doesn't last. It's, because of course, we're also dealing with states that have far less capacious monitoring and controlling mechanisms at their disposal. The capacity of a modern state to control its population is infinitely greater than used to be the case until far into the 19th century. So there's that element.
Right.
Then there was, it dissipated, it was never really written up, even if it was in a law, it was violated and then it sort of disappeared. But there was also the fiscal element, almost invariably. Wine, alcohol brought in a lot of tax revenue. It's the eternal problem. Look at cigarettes today. Governments are inclined to ban cigarettes. At the same time, they depend on the tax revenue.
Right.
So it's a dilemma, right? So there was always that element. So Shah, sultans would ban alcohol upon coming to power during, at the onset of a campaign, sort of seeking the good graces of the heavens, so to speak, points at old age, preparing for the end, repenting, tawbah in Persian, very important element. And then finally, of course, the idea that, during calamities, natural disasters, plagues, locusts, famine, you look for a culprit and you find them in the Jews or, minorities typically. And then, of course, wine is oftentimes singled out as the real culprit. And so you get a ban, but they never last. True.
On the topic of the minorities you just mentioned, I tried to do an unscientific study of my own over the last couple of days as I was preparing for this, asking people, especially some of our team members, some others that I know who've come from Iran, say within the last 10 years, what did you see? What was the relationship with alcohol? Where, first of all, I mean, we'll get to, again, the 21st century in a moment, but it was amazing that all of them said, alcohol is everywhere if you want it, in Iran. But they said everybody has an Armenian person that they know, which you said a few moments ago. And it occurs to me that this is probably, this is the 21st century, but this is something that, for hundreds of years has kind of been the case. If I could ask you, is it fair to say that for most of, say, the last 500-600 years, the cultivation, the production, the manufacturing, or the distribution has been the work of non-Muslims in the country who the Muslims access to get the alcohol? Is that the way it works?
For the most part, not exclusively, absolutely for most. I've known of statistics for pre and early modern times, but definitely, I already mentioned the regions, towns where Christians, Armenians, in the case of Iran, Zoroastrians were prevalent. There was more wine drinking because, again, they were not allowed to sell, but that's exactly what happened typically, right? And so the reason, for example, if you wanted to go get your wine in Isfahan, you'd cross the river to Zayan the route, you went to Nudulfa, right? And there were excursions being held by Muslims, and Armenians were also given to drinking quite frequently. So yeah, there is an element, and that there's nothing modern about it. Yeah, you had your Armenian to go to. Of course, the Armenians and the Greeks in Ottoman Empire, they also played a double role because they were also easy scapegoats. So they're quite vulnerable. Right. It was all, look the other way, don't ask, don't tell, marginal and so forth. And as long as and this is really the crucial issue. In pre-modern times, early modern times, until quite recently, and in a way, depending on the region and the country still today, alcohol was kind of allowed, connived at, as long as it didn't disturb the social order. So, keep a low profile, keep it indoors, go to the Armenian bar, come out late at night, so we don't have to see you, all these mechanisms. But, the position of these minorities was, of course, precarious, because they would be the first to be singled out for a mob riled up by the clergy in the late 19th century. I give a couple of examples in the book, who then start smashing the taverns of Armenians, the same taverns they used to frequent themselves, of course.
What happens in the 19th century? I mean, again, I know your book is quite comprehensive, and we're zooming through it here, but with the coming of the Ottoman Empire and, of course, the Qajar era, alcohol drinking consumption increases. Is that a measure that Islam has less dominance, or is it just people are figuring out more ways to get the stuff, to make the stuff, to drink the stuff?
I'm not sure if alcohol consumption increases in sheer volume. It's hard to tell, and certainly no statistics are available, but it becomes more visible, certainly, and it's all under the influence in one way or another of the European intrusion, the Western intrusion. It comes in the form of, diplomacy, war, Napoleon invading Egypt, and France invading Algeria in 1830, and in the form of economic control and monopolization and so forth. And so on the other side, it comes in the form of the Sultan beginning to leave his palace in the early 19th century under the influence of European models, czars and dukes and emperors going on sort of controlled excursions, boat rides, and so forth. So Mahmud II does the same in Istanbul, comes out of his palace. The elite, the new bureaucratic elite, takes over from the Janissaries, hardcore traditional drinkers, who are eliminated in 1826. This new elite, they become sort of Europe lovers. They adopt the ways and means of Europe, both sartorially in terms of clothing, but also in terms of habits, especially drinking habits. They love champagne, bubbly, effervescence. And it's not even seen as alcohol. It's like lemonade. You know what I mean? That's literally what some of the clerics see it as well. And so the Sultan gingerly begins to approach this. He goes on boat rides. He tastes a little bit of porter or sherry and loves it, orders 10 bottles and so forth. So the things open up. And then in the course of the century, radical change takes place. Infrastructurally, the railroad comes to Istanbul direct from Europe. Electrical light is introduced. Hotels are set up, Western-style hotels. So the whole panoply of opportunities are open. The hold of Islam on the elites diminishes. So all this leads to greater, certainly, visibility. I'm not even sure consumption, and new forms. Iran is a little different. First of all, it's a bit later, but Iran is much more isolated structurally and logistically than the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul was a 5-day boat ride away from Marseille. Right. Iran, you had to go around the Cape,
right, of course,
until the building of the Suez Canal. A world of difference, right? So it comes later. The distances are much greater, much more desert to be crossed. Stronger hold of the clergy, which does play a role a little bit. And then the other thing, very interesting and very importantly, is that as opposed to the Ottoman Sultan, who begins to leave his palace, the Qajars sort of retreat into their palaces. See, Safavid drinking was open, was kind of as Razmubazm, hard drinking and hard fighting and hard feasting tradition, right? Out in the open, the steppe warfare. The Safavids do that because they have religious credentials. After all, they established the Shi'i faith, the 12er Shi'i faith, as their state religion. The Qajars lack that legitimacy. So they cannot continue that tradition. They retreat into the palace. They sober up to some extent. And then, you see this with Nasruddin Shah. I think I give a couple of examples. He drinks, but it's become sort of a Frenchified European type of, 2 glasses of Bordeaux over wine, or to calm his nerves before executions that he has to watch. So it's a world away from this, go all out and being completely flat for days on end. That tradition continues in the provinces in Iran, and I pointed out too. You have these sort of traditional provincial rulers, governors, especially Kurds in Khorasan, and they're just, hammered on days on end. That's continuation of what I call traditional drinking.
And tell me about the different kinds of drinks that emerge from different regions, from different countries. You talked about it a little earlier, outside of the scope of red wine. Like Roqe is something that emerges from in Turkey. And right. In Iran, there's arak. What is arak?
Well, it's kind of a form of vodka. You know, I'm not even quite sure what the ingredients are, quite frankly, but that becomes kind of the Iranian Roqe becomes arak, the same quality, the same potency, the same popularity because you get drunk very fast.
And is that
The
20th
original,
century? Is that the 20th century?
well, no, vodka actually is introduced from Russia already in the 16th, 17th century as part of gifts to the Shah. Lots of barrels of vodka are being brought from Moscow, from Muscovy in the 16th and 17th century. So, and I'm not quite sure how that transfers or translates into arak over time. But it's kind of a, that it's the Iranian variant of rake, if you will. It's not made from grapes. It's made from, what is it, barley or something like that. I forget the technicalities of that.
You do say that in Iran under Pahlavi rule and under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi that after the 1940s, because Reza Shah has an interesting, even though he takes after Ataturk, he has an interesting issue with alcohol, whereas Ataturk opens things up in Turkey. But after the 1940s, alcohol sales and consumption grow alongside modernization in Iran. And I guess by the 1970s, is the main alcoholic drink arak then that is most available, or is red wine everywhere as well?
Yeah, that depends on class. For the traditional luti, arak was the drink of choice, right? And for the sort of the lower classes in general, I would argue, the Lalazar in district was all about arak, cabarets and performances and so forth. I remember going there. It was all arak. But, the sort of the Focoli, the Frenchified classes took to French wine. And the more Americanized later ones, young people, they took to whiskey, sitting at the Hilton Hotel or, any of these new fancy hotels. So again, I think you have to differentiate it a little bit between between classes. I remember the street where I lived, Khiyaban Farbadin, close to university. There was a liquor store, and I really regret I never took a picture of it because it was all, razed to the ground and disappeared. Right. And I can't even find pictures of these places. And it was kind of dark and dank. It was on a corner, but it was kind of, entering a forbidden space. And it was, kind of an unsavory place where you would buy your pint CD of arak, right? This, pint-sized bottle. And the people who went there were not exactly the elites, to put it that way.
What was you talked about that whatever that place was, that being razed to the ground, being destroyed presumably after 1979. What was the impact of the 1979 Islamic Revolution on alcohol in Iran?
Well, it drove it underground, of course, because, the Islamic Republic, after some hesitancy, took a combat approach to alcohol. With very dramatic examples of wine being poured out into the gutters of these big international hotels. I give examples of that, and smashing of wine stores and the restaurants and so forth. And
sorry, can I ask you about that? Because you have a photo in your book of these revolutionaries. It's so jarring. You know about these things if you've studied the revolution, and we've talked about it so much, but you still see a photo like this and go, holy shit, these guys, revolutionaries, emptying bottles during the 1979 revolution. I guess this is to say there's at this point a renaissance in equating alcohol with Western consumption and materialism. Is that the idea?
Of course, alcohol becomes symbolic. I mean, it's the same in Egypt in 1952 with Black Saturday. The revolt that preceded the palace revolution that brought Nasser to power. When thousands of liquor stores and cabarets and casinos on the Pyramid Road were smashed, all the symbols of British and Jewish presence, and then included all the alcohol-purveying venues, the same thing. Because, yes, alcohol was always kind of associated with Christianity in Islam, right? And I give some examples of that without necessarily working it out. But it became really an emblem of Western decadence and debauchery, not just in Iran, but in as part of the wave of quote-unquote fundamentalism that has coursed through the Middle East since 1928, 29, Muslim Brothers in Egypt. It's like women and the head cover and alcohol are the two emblems, the two symbols par excellence that have to be extirpated, that have to be completely destroyed in order to present yourself as a good Muslim. which
Yeah.
then creates all kinds of new dilemmas, of course.
And at one point in the book, you say, I want to quote you, you say, modern Muslim fundamentalists exclusively focus on the textual dimensions of Islam,
sure.
as if they had inherited colonialism's ignorance of the religion's history of diversity and tolerance. Is this, Rudy, is this to suggest the current leaders of say the Islamic Republic have a more draconian take on alcohol than for most of our history after the coming of Islam?
Yeah, I would argue that. Of course, there were periods, don't get me wrong. I don't say that, it was all happy-go-lucky and everyone could just drink and no one was bothered. Not at all. There were these episodes of intervention, and bans were sometimes enforced and sometimes very harshly. People were, 80 lashes, executed. There was wholesale terror in various periods all over the place. So it's not simply a story of, I don't romanticize. And I think I said it explicitly, I think, in my introduction as well. But it is definitely true. The Islamic Republic has, singled out certain elements and engaged in a great deal of amnesia with regard to the history of alcohol in Iran, historically speaking. Of course, the problem is, whereas Abu Nuwas and other, Arab popes have been kind of expurgated from the curriculum in the Arab world, Hafiz and Khayyam and the rest of it loom too large and are too important and component of Persian culture to be even curtailed. They have made attempts, but it's, doomed to fail. So in that sense, they're kind of stuck with that tradition because it's part and parcel of, what it means to be Iranian, even acknowledged by all but the most hardline clerics in modern Iran.
Yes. And the contradictions abound on so many levels. I mean, obviously, there's the one big contradiction that we stated at the beginning: the paradox of Islam being of alcohol being forbidden, but alcohol being everywhere. But also in terms of the way any penalties or any the way the state, say in the case of the Islamic Republic, handles this is all over the place. I mean, it's like a lot of the other things we've learned from parts of the Middle East and Iran these days, unfortunately. But just doing a straw poll again of some of the people who work at Roqe and some of our friends, almost everybody was saying, yeah, sure, there's these parties and there's alcohol and everybody knows somebody where they're going to get it and whatever. And then somebody was saying, yeah, I have a friend who got put in jail, got an 11-year jail sentence because he had some wine in his house, and he was, I don't know if he was making the wine or he was, and how you make heads or tails of this kind of discrepancy and how the penalization is meted out. Did you learn anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I visited Iran a couple of times in the last few years, and it's totally true. It's all over the place. I mean, everyone makes wine in their own bathtub, and some of it's quite good, by the way. Or you get it from your Armenian friend, or, your Saqi, the peik who delivers it on the back of the scooter, right? Or you get it, smuggled over the mountains from Iraq, which is very expensive. And so the state, of course, knows all about this and has this, it's all over the place. It has a very confusing attitude. It's part deterrence and it's part harm reduction because there's A&A in Iran all over the place and sponsored by the state. So it sort of bespeaks confusion and an inability to really come to terms with the thing. And I think it ultimately, again, goes back to they cannot acknowledge it. That's where Islam is always stuck. It's in the Quran, and you cannot deny that. You cannot turn it into sort of a metaphorical verse, as Christians have done with most parts of the Bible. So you're always brought back to that point, and at the same time, you have to deal with the modern world and youth culture, and sort of global party culture. Right. And of course, as we all know, Iranians are the best party animals in the world. So you go to the best parties in the world going to Iran, right? And then of course, there's all this ambiguity. You pay off deposit on, and it's limited to keep the number of decibels down. It's okay, but then again, you're never sure.
And it's not unique to Iran. These contradictions. I remember earlier in the year being in Dubai and being in a place, in a restaurant, or and they said I had ordered a drink, and they said, oh, you don't have alcohol. It's not allowed here. And I thought, well, two streets away. I was, I just
Sure.
got a drink
Yeah.
the other day. So, and
I
I
mean, you
can't
pay
make heads or tails of it.
$18. You pay $18 for a glass. So there's also that deterrence. That's how Erdogan in Turkey has dealt with it. You price it out of existence for ordinary people.
I was going to mention Erdogan because you do talk about him in the book as well, and there's an increasing campaign against alcohol from him and his administration in the 21st century now as well in Turkey, right?
Yes. Yeah, and it comes in all kinds of forms. Ever since he's become president, he tried already when he was mayor of Istanbul in the late 1990s, but he's really gone all out in the 21st century, mostly by, with fiscal means, literally pricing it out of existence by raising the taxes to absurd heights. A bottle is now, like $25 of cheap Roqe, and Roqe is by definition cheap, which means with a normal income in Turkey, middle class, you can buy like 15 bottles a month, and that's it, right? And then also he has engaged in this policy of, zoning, concentrating wine drinking mostly for tourists in tourist zones in Izmir and Istanbul, Kuşadası, and so forth, Antalya, or relegating wine purveying pavilions, they call them in Turkey. It comes from the French, become sort of cheap drinking venues to highways between cities, out of sight, in other words. And then, not allowing it after sale after 10 o'clock, prohibiting it during Ramadan, and so forth. A variety of measures.
Rudy, you mentioned the proliferation of homemade wines, of people making wine in their bathtub, you said, in Iran. That's been happening for a long time, right? I mean, that's something that's not new.
Well, certainly since the revolution. And people have become very sophisticated about it.
Well,
and when the harvest comes in September, it's sometimes hard to get grapes because they all get bought up by people to turn into homemade wine.
But when you say some of it's quite good, I don't doubt that. At the same time, we're hearing these reports of these people dying in Iran because they tried to make homemade wine and they're using the wrong stuff, or it's poisoned, or how do we make sense of that?
Well, I get the impression, I'm not 100% sure about that, but from reading these articles this week and last week, that it is precisely the stuff delivered by the Peigs of uncertain provenance that is suspect. And that's one reason why people have begun to concentrate or actually tell their friends when they offer their wine, this is homemade, it's safe, because I know what the ingredients went into it. But again, I'm not quite sure how that works. And of course, this lethal elements of methanol alcohol has been going on for a couple of years now. I gave examples from 2017 and 18, hundreds of people killed. So it's flared up again. But it's a perennial problem, of course, yes.
Where do you, before I let you go, and I thank you so much for the time today and for writing this book that I hope people who have any interest in this area check out, because it's wondrous and it's quite, as I say, comprehensive. Angels tapping at the wine shop's door. Where do you see things going? I mean, there's an interesting stat you throw in at some point in the book, and you don't really explore it too much, but you say, whereas alcohol intake in most European countries is declining, in the Islamic world, it went up by 25% between 2005 and 2010. Now, that's 10 years ago, but still, is the Middle East increasingly a serious growth market for wine and beer?
Well, as so far, and again, it depends on the country, and it varies from country to country, of course, in terms of strictures. Afghanistan is not a growth market at the moment, to put it simply, right? But Morocco, North Africa is. And so it's hard to tell. There are certain tendencies that are premised on continued growth and continued tourism and so forth that speak to continued growth. But at the same time, as we all know, the future is totally unpredictable. No one predicted the Iranian Revolution, and wine and alcohol seemed to be on the upswing. And the Shah introduced new wines and wanted to latch on to, sort of sophisticated modern wine culture and so forth. On the other, Saudi Arabia is loosening up. It's trying to become an events culture. So who knows what MBS has in mind?
Right.
He could allow zones, and I think it's actually quite likely. But then again, you have an intensely conservative populace to deal with. So the backlash may also come. So I'm not going to predict anything other than it will remain complex. And the dilemma as long as Islam remains the dominant religion, and as long as Muslims look towards a text for guidance, that awkwardness, that dilemma will always be there.
Yes, I was going to say, you conclude the book by saying the Islamic world is still in its own process, your words, of decolonization when it comes to alcohol and drinking practices. Just tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, no, I will do that by quoting, and I love this. I don't know if you know Kamel Daoud. He's Francophone, Algerian, journalist, literateur. It's fantastic. You should read him. Okay. He's also been translated to English in case your French isn't that good. Beautiful writing, very critical and expansive and humanitarian. And I'll quote what he says, okay, by way of perhaps conclusion and certainly answer to your question. He says it best when he laments that the straitjacket that his Arabness imposes on him for preventing him from discovering himself, from embracing not just his Muslim identity, but also his Roman and Ottoman past, acknowledge the Spanish, Christian, and Jewish influence on the land of his birth and residence, Algeria, which even while facing the sea, finds it hard to retrieve its Mediterranean identity. And I think that really sums it up.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
It was fun to be invited and to be able to hold forth on this topic. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Congratulations on this book. You're going to have to keep writing books so that I can keep bringing you back, because I enjoy these conversations so much.
I'll try. No promise, but I'll try.
Dr. Rudi Matthee, thank you, and to be continued. Khodafis.
Khodafis, Shama.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This is Roqe episode 273, Drinking in Iran. Microphones are back on with Smart Pegah here in the studio, and Captain Reza, the great, our dear friend and director of the show for the first 2.5 years of Roqe. Let me start with you, Reza. What were your impressions listening to Dr. Rudi there?
Well, I'll tell you this, man. I want to move back to Shiraz after listening to...
It's all Shiraz. Everything's...
I know, right? It sounds like a lot of fun. And I couldn't be... it's so interesting to, get a backstory of what you've witnessed in real life, experienced it in the flesh. It's everything he said, to the T, was accurate, and then it's just so fascinating to see the psychological roots of what we were just talking about, literally earlier before the interview, and I'm fascinated. And yes, Jian, I know you want me to read this book. I will. I know you'll love it. Driving me crazy.
It would be nice for you to read a book. It would be an interesting experiment.
A book. If you must know, I've read several books.
What did you think of the part where he's talking about towards the end there, where we were talking about how the current situation in a place like Iran is actually more conservative? Mm-hmm. The colonial ignorance, taking Islam and going even way further in a direction that it has been for hundreds of years. I mean, it's not something new to us. We know that, but
I think I truly, especially after listening to this interview, I truly believe that alcohol and and all these elements that essentially the Islamic regime of Iran, I'd say, a place that it opposes extreme rules, is God-given gift to them. Because if these tools didn't exist, they wouldn't be able to use an access to really control the narrative in terms of monetary benefits where they control the underground.
Oh, it's a grift.
I
You
truly
see it as a
think
way
so. I believe it. Yeah.
They use the forbidding of alcohol to be involved in the alcohol trade.
Exactly. And
Is the regime involved? Well, I guess that's a stupid question. Right?
well, that's
I mean-
exactly. Their goons are, because it's winning on both sides. It's having the face of clean society by their phony
Definition of
standards,
clean
definitions,
society,
of course. And then, but on the other hand, also realizing, because they know they're not stupid. They know that you can't like go against them when everybody is a customer. It's just smart to capitalize. So they do that the way
So
they
how
do.
do
And
they
then-
make money? Because I mean, they can't tax.
so,
it the
for
way-
instance, I don't know if you're up to date about the current poisoning, alcohol poisoning in Iran. That is kind of
Mentioned
a
it in the
serial
interview,
poisoning.
yeah.
So the fact that something like this is so prevalent that hits the news, that means the gang involved in it. And again, this is not me talking like out of my bottom, but based on things I've heard on the news and analysis, that it seems like there are bigger hands at play. That they allow such a huge import of alcohol, essentially, because this is not all homemade alcohol that was poisoning. This is actual imported whiskey and
Oh, I thought it was the
Jack
homemade
Daniels. No,
stuff.
no. In fact, the homemade ones, people are now retrieving to like they're trying to get their hands
Go
on
back
more
to that.
homemade stuff. Yeah, go back to more homemade stuff because it's safer. Essentially, everybody's trying to find an Armenian dealer now, as opposed to get their hands on like the highest Jack Daniel that came from Turkey, because that's the stuff that that is poisoned. So
What did you make of the conversation?
I was just confused. There were so many like rules that you can drink, but then you can't, and you can drink but not get drunk, and then there's grapes and this and that, and I was like, what is happening here? I was surprised and a little bit confused with that, but there was a couple of things that I had no idea, like the word alcohol or booze and the origin of those words.
Arabic?
I had no idea. The social integration that we talked about at the top of the show, and then also Rudi mentioned, was really, really interesting to me.
What do you mean by the social integration?
So the lack of social integration of alcohol. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And then one thing that I thought was surprising, but also not, was the Islamic Republic, and like Reza was saying, the way that they're trying to be so extra about the fact that there should be no alcohol and everything else, and yet it's the most we've ever seen in Iran, right? So that was, I mean, again, not surprising, but it was an interesting part of the conversation for sure.
Well, the first thing you said, in terms of, it definitely is, if there's a through line, it's about contradiction. That the contradictions contradictions are so rich that you can't even get one narrative on what Islam says about alcohol. There's a bunch of different. He spends some of the book, and he did in this interview, talking about how there's a few different interpretations of the Quran, saying, for example, like you said, it's all about drunkenness. So if you can drink, but just don't drink too much. So then the alcohol shouldn't be the problem. And then there's others that it's about, it's if it's the grape, or depending on which the alcohol is, or and you sort of see that reflected in the confused way it's all dealt with. I mean, and we did talk about a little bit about some of the other places in the world that, like I was talking about being in Dubai, and you don't know where in Dubai. I don't know. I mean, sure, the people who live there would know, but that there's some places in the city where they look at you weird if you ask for a drink and alcohol. There's no alcohol, and there's other places where where there's a lot of drinking, and so it is quite confusing. And to me, the one revelation, which is very simple, I suppose you could look it up on the internet or something, but to learn that Islam, it also just makes sense when you think about it, but Islam is the only major religion that forbids alcohol.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, alcohol is deeply embedded in the traditions, cultures of other major religions. Think about it, right?
Yeah, and another thing that is adds to the confusion is the conviction in everything they say. Because I haven't, truth be told, read the thing, but based on what he's saying, is like, yes, you could drink, but don't get drunk.
Right.
Okay, so it's very definitive. And but Like it just continues. It's like a cycle. If you drink, but no alcohol in it. But if it's alcohol, it just sounds like there's no gray. Even the gray area, it's like this is 100% uncertain. It's like it's just, the conviction I think adds to the uncertainty, and then people they have the tendency to be a little bit on the extreme side. They interpret it however they want to in their own like way, right?
Extremes. The other thing was when you guys were talking about excessiveness and going into how excessive drinking and things like that, and I think there was something that Rudy mentioned about, well, if you're gonna sin, then one drop is a sin, and so is
might as well go for it. Yeah, drink the whole barrel. That's what.
I thought that was interesting too.
The governing philosophy is
exactly.
Why just have one drink if you're gonna have the drink? Go for it. He did talk about how there was in the book. I mentioned it, and that there's these. Famously, these leaders in it, like Shah Abbas, who was constantly drinking. Like again, it's like it's really
like a
funny,
guy.
you know. I mean, it's like forbidding homosexuality and being publicly out or something. It's like how these contradictions play themselves out. Where
they want to have it both ways. That's the thing, because they're smart enough to know that they can't go against the public. But on the other hand, they got a crowd to appease.
But you know what else? Prohibition never works.
No,
it's we learned it over and over again.
That's right.
Learned it in North America in the early part of the 20th century. It just doesn't work. It didn't work with cannabis, with marijuana here, and I mean it just creates a culture of perhaps more interest.
I think it feeds it, actually. I think it fuels it more than anything else. You always want what's forbidden.
Exactly. Like even like head covering, hijab, which was the cause of this whole revolution that started last year. It's the force to do anything, literally anything. You have to do it. Why? Like give me a solid reason, and all the reasons are all debatable. They're up for debate. So
again, the contradictions of the way we are perceived. That's why I started the interview with like, what do you think the perceptions are of the Islamic world? The contradictions of the way Iranians are perceived versus what Iranians know. If you ask go up to the average Iranian in Toronto and say, is it forbidden in Islam back in Iran? They'll sort of go, yeah. Nobody listens to that stuff, and yet, if for non-Iranians who aren't familiar, they would just assume that this is it's certainly a place you can't get a drink at a bar, and on what bar?
You know what's interesting?
I remember every time I say bar, you guys always laugh.
Yeah.
You guys would meet up at the bar in Shiraz? What bar? What are you talking about?
It was so heartbreaking to hear when he said that there was this liquor place around the corner where he lived, and he forgot to take a picture of it. Now it doesn't exist anymore. That guy, I kind of feel for that guy.
But you know what? I didn't actually ask him about it, but there's a point in the book where he's talking about his own experience. Yeah. Rudi Matthee, because of course he was in Iran and he went back a few times after the revolution. And I think after this is like 2015 or something. He's in Iran. I can't remember what it was. It was like for some conference or something. And he goes there, and it's like an event, like it's like a private sort of event, and he goes up and he says, can I get a tea or something? And the guy says, oh, you don't want to drink? And he goes, well, no. And kind of looks around and goes, oh, can I get a drink here? And the guy goes, yeah. What do you want? And he goes, well, I don't know. I guess this is like a story in the book. It's like I'm telling a joke, but it's like he goes, well, he's trying to think of like what's easy. He goes, a beer? Would a beer be okay? And the guy goes, yeah. What kind of beer?
Oh my!
And he goes, like a German beer? And he goes, yeah. Which kind?
Oh my god!
Oh my gosh!
Which is kind of the point,
great,
right?
Yeah.
It's like you can get whatever you want in Iran.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of being doing it the right way.
Yeah. When you were saying the perceptions, I was thinking, a great example of that would be Qatar, what we just saw with the World Cup and everything, right? With everyone thinking, well, how are people going to drink, and how are people? And it was just such a big question, and yet readily available if you need it to
Well,
be.
at first it wasn't, and then it was. I mean, even that was all screwed up, right?
Again, again, contradictions, but yeah, I think it was
Yeah.
from the get-go you could have gotten it.
All right. We'd love to hear what you guys think out there about this this topic. If you have any personal experiences and or if you want to address this paradox, or if you think we're all wrong and want to assert that, that's also welcome. info@roqemedia.com, or post on any of our platforms. info@roqemedia.com is our email address. Before we end up, I wanted to do a roundup. We usually do it earlier in the show, but I wanted to get to the topic and get to Dr. Matthee. Pegah, Reza's here as well, and let's do a little bit of a roundup on what's been going on the last few days. So take it away.
I think one of the biggest things on a lot of Iranians' minds is this video or viral kind of live stream that this young theater actor by the name of Mohammad Sadiqi shared on Instagram, and it was essentially a video or a stream of him being arrested.
Right.
So for anyone who hasn't seen it, Mohammad Sadiqi is a young actor. He's been quite vocal the last little while.
Is he well known? Do people know his work? No.
I didn't know him prior to this video, honestly. But I mean, when I was looking into this for the roundup, I was looking at his I was trying to find his Instagram, and I was looking on Twitter, and he's got a fair following. I mean, I don't know if it's because of this video now or if it was prior to it, but anyhow, for anyone who hasn't seen the video, he's expressing his concern, I guess, for the morality police and what they're doing with young women in Iran. And as he's saying this, I guess the regime is seeing his post, and so they come to his house.
Right.
And then he ends up switching to live on Instagram, and you can actually hear them pounding at the door, and then subsequently they enter the house, and he tries to run away, and it becomes this just chaotic, dramatic escape.
Wow.
To the point where there's a part where he's hanging out the window, and he's ready to basically jump out the window and yet not be taken away by the police. Ultimately, they do end up arresting him, and unfortunately, we have not heard anything since.
Yeah. It got a lot of attention, and I was wondering why, because he's not a huge star or something, but it probably is because we're not used to. Now we've seen a bunch of video. We've seen atrocities that take place in the streets or things like that. We're not used to seeing a live stream.
We've always seen it after the fact, and it's been kind of news, or we've heard it from people, or we've seen photos, and it's always been at least within a couple of hours of that event taking place. This was in the moment.
Yeah.
You were seeing it live, and I don't think we've ever experienced anything like that in the last 10 months.
Yeah, and that's another thing, and you've always heard about it, but since last year, a lot of these mysteries that you didn't know whether they were myths or you could really believe it. Like, did they actually torture you that bad? Did they actually did that to women?
Right.
Really, like, came like true. Like, we realized that it was more than true. So this is like another essentially testament to like they break into your house if you say the wrong thing, and they would arrest you.
You're right. Watching a live arrest on video is not open to interpretation.
Exactly.
We see what's happening
literally happened. Yeah.
What else you got, Pegah?
There was news of another, I guess, activist, Sepideh Qolian. So she's an activist journalist who's currently serving a 2-year sentence for chanting against the supreme leader and, of course, not wearing hijab. So she was actually supposed to have a day in court yesterday, and there was some back and forth about this, and she decided to actually represent herself and was saying, I'm more than willing to represent myself and have my day in court, and I want it to be public. And so, court was in session, judge was there, everything was ready, and then there was all this commotion and waiting and back and forth, and eventually her court date got canceled, or postponed rather. And so the reason for that, we now have found out, is because she refused to wear a hijab to enter the court. So even while being in prison, while having that court date, she's still
Defiant.
Yeah, exactly. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about the morality police, something we've talked about lots and lots the last 10 months, but they are coming back with a vengeance, it seems.
Oh boy.
So on Sunday, there were reports and a spokesperson from, I guess, I don't even know what to call it, from the morality police, I guess. I don't know.
Do you have a spokesperson?
Apparently they do. He made it very clear that they would be having vans out on the streets, unmarked vans this time. They're dropping the name morality police, and that anyone who still insists on breaking the norms will be dealt with. In addition to that, patrolmen will now be wearing body cameras and cracking down, I guess.
So 2 things on that. First of all, do you remember there was that moment 2 or 3 months into the uprising when somebody put out the idea that Iran was going to abolish the morality police?
What a joke.
Well, we knew it was a joke. We knew not just a joke, but we knew it was a dangerous sort of narrative to put out there because it would soften the opposition to the regime and sort of take the wind out of some of the protests. Because people will go, oh,
And
the regime is... Well, it didn't work. And also we see it's not only not true, it's the opposite of the truth.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing is that we have been hearing that, or we've been talking about, perhaps prematurely, but certainly with desperate hope, that the goalposts have moved in Iran. I mean, how many times did we say, well, at least Iran will never be what it was like before September 2022, right?
Yeah.
And a big part of that is saying, I just came back from Iran. There's women walking around without a hijab. This is never going back. Everybody's, and now we see that, as the crackdown, which is a lot more insidious right now. We've been talking about this, right? The crackdown is that now that the eyes of the world have turned away, or have softened their glare, the regime is really going after everyone, right? And with back pay, it's like retroactively. Oh, by the way, you did this in November. Now we're imprisoning you, and nobody's going to find out. Now we're going to execute you. Now we're going to, and this thing with the hijab is part of that. I mean, it's like they have no. It's almost they're like, oh, you tried a revolution, fuck you. Well, wait till you see what we're going to do now, right? And now that we've survived it, now that we're still in power, it's deeply disheartening. It's deeply disheartening.
And we see it because there's all sorts of new punishments that they're coming up with. I mean, I feel like I say this so often on this program, where the Islamic Republic continues to do things that surprise me, but then at the same time don't. It's like I've come to expect this certain level of just barbarians, right? But I mean, we've seen there was an actress who was sentenced to counseling sessions for a personality disorder because she wore a hat instead of a scarf. I mean,
Isn't that crazy?
Absurd. Or there were women who were
insane.
sentenced to washing corpses because they didn't have proper hijab.
The news came out that the fact-finding group, the fact-finding mission, they discovered that essentially the poisoning of girls, the school girls, was retaliation from the regime.
Unbelievable.
That was on BBC. That came out, like, literally. So this is this is very obvious that it's Khamenei's people and regime essentially against people of Iran. It's Iran against the regime. There is no gray line. And the leftists, the Zarif, all the Nayak, all the people that still were hoping for some sort of reform, and then through that hopefully more change, and slowly you've come into a democratic place. It's just that was all part of the regime. That was all the front and the ploy to distract.
There's people still saying that.
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
people. I know somebody this weekend said to me, "Well, when Khamenei dies, his son will be maybe like MBS. He'll be a little bit more, progressive, and things will slowly change." And it's like,
and what until then? We just continue.
Well, not just what until then. I mean, we've seen that act before, right? In the early 2000s, that was the reform movement. It didn't amount to anything.
That's
it was
right.
there was 2 years of smiling, and then that stopped, right?
This is.
So I mean, it's tough one. In terms of stuff going on in the diaspora, there's the big Tirgan festival this weekend, and our own smart Pegah. You're gonna be hosting or emceeing something.
You're
ready.
emceeing Tirgan?
I am.
Are you ready? Do you have your lines?
I am ready.
Okay.
Starting tomorrow.
Are you emceeing in English or in Persian?
English.
Oh,
Interesting.
We're gonna leave the Farsi to someone who's better suited.
Right.
interesting.
That could be a fun gig for you.
I know, right? I don't think anybody wants to hear me speak in English or Farsi.
To be honest, it's I respect you, and I'm wishing you great, but these are thankless gigs. These MCing gigs, as somebody who did it for years, it's really you may end up at the end of the weekend going, oh my God, why did I do that? But hopefully you'll get some lovely feedback, and you'll meet some nice people. And are they going to introduce you as Pegah?
Smart Pegah.
Are they smart?
They're going to introduce me as Smart Pegah.
Are they?
No, I'm joking.
Oh, why not?
Dude, people are not supposed to just stick with the name you give them for the rest of their lives.
Listen,
like
she's
on their
a
social
major
daily.
player in Roqe Media.
Yeah, but that's work.
Well, so is MCing, dear God.
Oh my God.
The captain, the great Captain Reza.
Yes, sir.
Hello,
I'm
sir.
doing an imitation of myself.
Listen, for 2.5 years, this guy at the beginning of the show, hello, sir. Now he's saying I do it.
Hello, sir.
We had you on a cheap microphone. And today you sound
That's true.
mellifluous.
We can hear you much better now.
Right? Now I sound like a normal person. Hello.
And Reza June.
Jian June.
You're always up to something interesting.
Thank you.
Your films are
right.
to be seen. Is there a new film that we can?
Actually, there is a documentary on Tubi you can watch. It's called Passport Control. It's about human smuggling out of Thailand. We have Rev, an action adventure on Amazon Prime, Netflix in the UK and Europe.
If you haven't seen Rev, check out Rev.
Yeah. You haven't seen Rev yet.
I've seen Rev.
You saw Rev?
Of course.
Do you remember the character Gordy?
Yes, the challenge. Yeah,
the challenge
yes,
one.
yes.
The challenge one.
Yes.
Yeah. That was played by me too.
Gordy is you?
Gordy's also me. I'm the cop and I'm Gordy. I play two characters.
And what's this Tubi thing? Well, how are we supposed to find
that's
Tubi?
what I was going to ask.
Tubi?
What's
you don't
Tubi?
know? What do you mean?
That's
What's Tubi?
It's a
That's
platform,
crazy.
right?
Yeah, it is a platform.
But where do we see it?
So Tubi is available on mobile, on anywhere, on smart TV, anywhere you get Netflix.
And that's what the doc is on.
That's where the doc is on, and it's Tubi is free of charge. Your own subscription is free, and it's just ad based, and it's Fox actually. So you get a lot of cool films like all the 90s, early 2000s.
Password control.
Passport
Control.
Passport Control.
I didn't realize you would finish that one. I really want. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
You've been
The
working on that
trailer is
for-
out. Yeah. It's been a minute. Yeah.
That's great.
Thanks,
All right. It's great to have you here, man.
Thanks, buddy.
Always.
So much fun.
Always.
Good to be here.
Anytime.
Good to be here. Yeah.
The great Ezra Cholet, an actor, a director, a bon vivant. You know what that means?
No, but sounds
Drinker.
like
Means a drinker.
a bon vivant.
A bon vivant means the guy who's the heart of the party.
Oh,
Yeah.
I know a gal in France who's bon vivant right now.
Oh.
Jian.
Oh, Keon.
our friend Jian.
This is our dear friend Keon
Yes.
has moved
to
Paris.
And she's living the Emily in Paris life.
She really is. She really is.
Kian doch Nademin Paris life.
She is. I mean, I am. I'm amazed by her Instagram.
Every other video is, oh my God, this chocolate is amazing.
But she's in palaces. And
she's loving it.
I'm
she's
sure
in-
it is, though.
Yeah.
It's
looks
incredible.
fantastic.
She looks like Cinderella in every other shot. I'm like, yeah, she's really struggling.
We love you, Keon.
We love you, Kian.
Thank you. Thank you, Smart Pegah.
Thank you.
This is Full Time for Roqe for today. For all things Roqe related, go to our website, roqemedia.com. Thanks to the amazing team who put this show together. Talented Anahita, Smart Pegah, Savvy Roham, Savs,
Savs.
Bearded Omid, Super Parry Sauce, Sound Person Louise. Thank you to all of you out there supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you've not done so already on any or all platforms. Have you subscribed on the platforms yet? Reza?
Yes, sadly, I get all the notifications.
Yeah, there's still probably a couple platforms you could join.
Oh boy, no, I'm good.
Find me on Instagram at Jian Gomeshi. Find Reza at Ezra Cholet. Find Pegah on stage at Tirgan. Mizun Bashin.